I come to this place of my ancestors. And I remember, like these blossoms, we are all dying. To know life in every breath, every cup of tea, every life we take, the way of the warrior. Life in every breath. That is Bushido.
Oh, hello there. I'm Jimmy Shuker, alongside Albert Chalmers and Shawn Goodman, and this is Radiant Light, a spiritual discussion podcast, episode 19. On today's episode, Albert and Shawn will be welcoming back a previous guest, Jamaal Riche, onto the show to discuss Bushido. Bushido is a Japanese warrior's code of ethics based on Zen Buddhism and has been used throughout much of Japanese history, and it is intended for when Zen Buddhism meets warfare. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And with that being said, I'll hand you guys over to Albert and Shawn, and I'll see you on the other side. Enjoy the episode.
Hey, Shawn, how you doing?
Doing pretty good, Albert. How about yourself?
Good, man. I'm still in BC here, so I have had nothing to do but look into Bushido, the topic of this episode, which is awesome. So I've fully immersed my mind in that, like steeped it like some green tea, you know?
Nice. So it's a good
Just so we could-
environment for that.
Yeah, definitely. Bushido itself is a code of the Japanese warrior known as the samurai. So we could literally translate it to the way of the warrior, right?
Yeah, that is correct. So Bushi is another word for warrior, which we'll get into a bit more the origin of that word later. And then Do is similar to the Chinese word Dao. Same word as Taoism. So it means like a way or a path, a road, a philosophy, essentially. So the word can literally be translated as the way of the warrior.
Well, it can also be traced back through the other episodes we did leading up. So we talked about Taoism, we talked about Confucianism, and then Shaolin, Zen Buddhism. So Bushido is essentially a direct descendant of those philosophical ways and everything, just mixed in with the Japanese warrior, right?
Mhm. That is correct. Although the history is quite complex and there's a lot of misconceptions about it. And Bushido, as it's commonly understood, if you ask people today, again, the idea has been really disseminated in Western culture. People, have perhaps learned about it from, samurai movies or watching Akira Kurosawa or watching anime, playing games, things like that. So a lot of people have a basic understanding of what Bushido was or is, but the actual historical reality is quite complex. It's not as simple as it's not a simple lineage that we can trace.
Yeah, I mean, for the sake of time and everything, I wanted to simplify it, but of course we have the room to go into the finer details here. Maybe we could go chronologically through the history, but I just wanted to kind of get the list out because there is a list. I don't know where the official list comes from, but it's Gi, Rei, Yu, Mio, Jin, Makoto, and Chu, which mean integrity, respect, courage, honor, compassion, honesty or sincerity, and duty/loyalty. But I don't know if that's a more recent list or if that's actually from the Sengoku Jidai, but maybe we could go back to the very beginning and find out where this comes from. In the beginnings, it's coming from, like we said, Chinese culture. So The Art of War by Sun Tzu is kind of like the original text, like the Book of Genesis or something, for these Japanese samurai. I don't know. I've read The Art of War, and you can definitely see it's mainly about strategy and whatnot. But obviously, with any kind of text like that, there's a philosophical foundation. Um, but yeah, can you just explain how this Bushido that we understand came about from the beginnings?
Absolutely. So I think first we need to go back to the origins of the samurai. So that would be a good starting point to understand uh, Bushido and some of its influence. Um, so the samurai, of course, there's as long as there's been Japan, there's been warriors. But the samurai as a class really starts around the Heian period. Yeah, so around this time, like the really late Yamato, early Heian, there was a series of conflicts in Japan between the modern descendants of Japanese people, and the Amishi people, who were probably most popularized in the film Princess Mononoke. So in that film is
Right.
Amishi, and she, as you can see in the film, she has a very again, they don't really know what these people look like, but in the film she adopts more of a indigenous sort of dress,
Right.
sort of aesthetic, and they're often described as being some of the original indigenous people of Japan.
Like the Ainu, is that similar to the Ainu?
So I was looking into this. There doesn't seem to be a consensus. So today, the Ainu are the one indigenous group of Japan that are not ethnically Japanese. So
Mm-hmm.
they're a pretty small minority. But yeah, they're still around today. But there's some debate as to whether the Amishi were related to them, or if they were a separate group, or if they got absorbed into the Ainu. There's a lot of debate. There doesn't seem to be a consensus as to exactly who they were. And again, not a lot is known about them. All that we know is from Japanese sources. Like they didn't leave behind any written records, so there's a lot of speculation there. So again, the kind of late Yamato period, this is the time where the Emishi are being kind of pushed out. They're being pushed up into off of Honshu into Hokkaido. They're kind of being pushed out, and there's this series of conflicts against them. And so originally in this period, the early predecessor to the samurai, they they kind of remind me in some ways of these early Greek hoplites. How each town was kind of it had young men who volunteered to be hoplites, and they had to have their own shield, their own spear. They had to have their kind of provide their own provisions, and they sort of joined these armies temporarily. So it was much like that, where each town was kind of required to have a certain number of men and or young men and provide a certain number of weapons to go on these campaigns. So this was the kind of the earliest class of the samurai, and they were fighting against the Amishi people. In the process, they adopted a lot of the Amishi tactics. So the Amishi are described as being having kind of tactics of guerrilla warfare, where they would rely heavily on horseback and archery. They would do kind of hit and run attacks like that. And so the Japanese, they start the early kind of predecessors to the samurai, they start to adopt um not necessarily guerrilla tactics, but they start to really prioritize skills like horseback riding, archery. So they are influenced by the Amishi. And as the Amishi are pushed out, the individuals who participated in these campaigns against them were rewarded by being given, grants of land. So it was a good way to basically get support, and to encourage, the different communities or fiefdoms to kind of join in this conflict. And so these warriors who participated in these campaigns, they're the kind of early predecessors to the samurai.
What were they called instead of samurai if they were the predecessors?
So around this period, again, around the Heian period, they became known as, I think, well, first they were Bushi, and then later, in the Heian period, the word sabarao, which means to
Okay.
serve. That's sort of the earliest word of samurai, and then sabarao developed into the word samurai. It's also worth explaining a little bit more of the structure of the Heian government. So at this time, they Japan was more or less unified, except for Hokkaido, and it was in it like an imperial government, but it was feudal. So the at this was the time period where the emperor still had power, as we're going to discuss later. That's going to change, and the power is going to shift to the shogun. But during this period, the Heian period, the emperor was still um, powerful, and it's a time that's really known for a flourishing of art and culture and poetry and the tale of Genji, and a lot of like classical Japanese poetry comes out of this period. Um, but as the imperial court turned more inwards to looking at arts, arts, focusing on arts and music and poetry and things like that, the kind of balance of power started to shift, where you had,
Already by then.
yeah, by the Heian period, it was already shifting. So the emperor was still in control, but these sort of local lords, again, who originally kind of derived their power from these Emishi conquests, and these lords started to gain more and more power, and you start to
It's
see this
kind of
shifting
like
balance.
in Europe, right? In Europe, they had the Crusades, and then many of the lords, the knights of the Crusades, were given lands, and the feudal system became basically the par for the course of Europe. So I guess Japan followed their own feudal system, but it was in a sense similar to our own over in the West. Is that
For
correct? Or
For sure. I mean, there's definitely similarities and parallels that we can draw. Again, just like in feudalism, it's a decentralized system where like a king, or in the Japanese case, the emperor, has perhaps nominal control over the country. The actual power is derived from the lords. So, under a feudal system, a king or an emperor is only has power as long as they have the support of their lords, right? Because
right.
the lords are the ones who are collecting the taxes, administering laws, providing soldiers, samurai, when there's a time of crisis or conflict, right?
But
So go ahead.
I was going to say, do we have any information on whether Zen Buddhism or Shintoism is considered because I know the emperor is the descendant of the gods in Shintoism, but I know Zen Buddhism had come over from China, and that's when there was a kind of, again, like you said, there's a shift, right, between the emperor and the shogun. I wonder if it's also the Shintoism and Buddhism shift coincided with that.
So I think another important event too, we have the Genpei War. So this is what kind of brings the end of the Heian period. And so this is sort of the Genpei War is sort of the moment where power, is going to, not permanently, but first for hundreds of years, the power balance is going to shift over to the shogun, the lords, and basically
Mm.
after that point is when the emperor is only going to have basically symbolic power, up until the Meiji restoration. So yeah, we have the Kamakura shogunate. So at this point, I like this. I wrote down that it was a diarchal hereditary military dictatorship. So essentially, so diarchal means there's two leaders, right? So again, at this time, the emperor is still seen as technically the leader. Like during this period, during these shogun periods, the system that arises is one where the shogun has the true power. The emperor still has a lot of symbolic power, has a lot of cultural power. And depending on the time period, there are more maybe daimyo that end up allying themselves with the emperor. There's times where the imperial house has more power. So it's not to say that they don't wield any real political power, but in actuality, this is the time period where the shogun is really the one behind the scenes. And at first, the shogun initially is just as a military leader. Um, in the very earliest days, it was someone that was appointed by the emperor during a time of crisis, kind of like a sort of like the dictator in Rome before the
Right.
yeah. So in the early Roman Republic, that sort of dictator, like if you think of Cincinnatus, who takes up arms, he leaves his farm, he leads the army, and then when the enemy's defeated, he goes back to his farm. So it's kind of like that, except the shoguns are successful at, again, yielding the real power, and it becomes, again, this role which is seen as temporary, or perhaps seen as the strongest person in the clan and the government, and it becomes hereditary, where the shogun's son or adopted son or someone is going to take over in his place. So that's essentially the government that that grows. And so this sort of gives us the rise of the samurai class. So this is the time period where, again, the shogun is powerful. The samurai class is, really yielding a lot of power in Japanese society during this period.
But it's very hierarchical at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
absolutely.
The samurai were upper class, but under the feudal lord, the daimyo, who's under the shogun, who's under the emperor. But in reality, you're saying the shogun is slowly climbing the ladder higher and higher towards overtaking the emperor.
Yeah.
And that happened in the Kamakura period.
Yeah, that's where it's official. Like the Heian is when the balance is shifting, and then the Kamakura is when the shogun is really, again, it's the Kamakura shogunate. So that's really the period where the shoguns are yielding the most power. So then the next period that we can get into here is the Sengoku period.
Basically, the Sengoku Jidai means the warring states period, and these different states warred against each other until Oda Nobunaga was able to basically infiltrate Kyoto and overtake the emperor in terms of power. Of course, he didn't establish like a solid empire or anything like that, but his successor was Hideyoshi, and he took further steps by taking swords from the villagers, and only he could decide who was a samurai. And
which was really funny because he was actually of peasant. He was a peasant, right? He was from the peasant class.
Yeah.
So it is one of those great ironies of history that, yeah, he that's how he's able to rise up, is through participating in the military. That's how he's able to raise his rank. But then he strips the ability of other peasants or farmers to be able to do that. So it's kind of ironic.
He climbed the ladder and then cut the rungs behind him or something. I don't know the analogy. He closed the door behind him, basically. But there's one famous family during that time, the Takeda family, and I know that they were opposers of Nobunaga and his gang. And we have a book called the Koyo Gunkan from 1616, where the first mention of Bushido comes from. But that would have been right at the tail end of the Sengoku, after Tokugawa Ieyasu successfully squashed all the rebellions and basically he filled the vacuum that Hideyoshi's he basically stole the power from his son, I believe, but he did a successful unification in terms of actually creating peace in this Edo period, which is when Musashi comes in, right? Because he had fought during the Sengoku Jidai and then became a Ronin after the end of that period.
Yeah, so the Sengoku period, again, so this is, so I think you gave there's a good overview there, but for the listeners, just to give a little bit more context here, this is the period when usually when there's samurai in like a video game or an anime or in Kurosawa films, usually this is the period that they're talking about. Not always, but it's sort of the
Yeah.
most famous of it. It's known again. It's quite complex. There's just lots of different lots of clans, lots of competing clans. There's
Super dense
yeah,
history.
like a good century, almost a century and a half of just constant fighting and wars. So it's a really really interesting period, and it's oftentimes romanticized, and this is kind of seen as like the golden age of the samurai. So yeah, at this time, like we were talking about this sort of the power balance before. So first it was the emperor, then it kind of leaned into the shogun. This is the period where there's sort of a power vacuum. The shogun is weak, the emperor is weak, and it's depending on the period that we're looking at. It's there's different clans that kind of like have more or less power depending on the time period. So it's really the era where the daimyo and the samurai are ruling. There's lots of wars, so it's a period that is really romanticized, and it's a period that is for later Bushido authors that they're constantly looking back towards.
Yeah, it's like a sense of nostalgia, but for something they didn't experience. But I think what happened, or what tends to happen, is we look back, and because it's so fascinating, we do romanticize that period. But if you read the story of Nobunaga, he was a bit tyrannical and a bit of a maniac himself, but very fascinating to study as a historical character for sure. But that again, that's the tail end of the Sengoku. When you read through all that period and all the things you looked into, do you think there was like a change of the Bushido, or was it just like a solidifying of the Bushido?
Right. So yeah, now that we've gotten this kind of background information of the samurai um, established here, yeah, I think it's good to kind of get into more of the Bushido history. Um, so again, Bushido is a term that's going to be used later, right? It is not a period that was used during this period. And
The
so
word
this is
itself, you mean, or the code?
kind of both, I guess. The word
It was
itself
just a
definitely, yeah.
it was
Sorry.
just a way of life as opposed to any written code or something.
Precisely. And again, it's going to depend. It depends on the era, the time period. I was finding too, even different clans had their own rules and codes. So again, a lot of times today, people will, have this misconception that, oh, it was this code that all samurai followed. But no, of course, there's certain things, right? That being brave, be showing bravery in battle, being a loyal retainer, being a loyal samurai to your daimyo, like these are certainly qualities that would have been respected, across a pretty wide period of time and across a lot of clans. But outside of just a few broad ideas, there's not like a very strict code that the samurai followed. And just to give you an idea here, I came across this. I thought this was really interesting. So this is one of the earliest sort of samurai codes that I was able to dig up here, and it's called the 17 Laws of the Asakura Clan, and it was written in 1480.
Wow.
So yeah, it's a very
So early
early.
Sengoku.
Yep. And so I read through the 17 laws, and they are really not what you would expect. So a few of them make sense. One of them was to promote men of rank based on their ability. Okay, that makes sense so far. Do not excessively covet expensive swords. Also comes into some of the ideas that we might have in Buddhism or Buddhism or Confucianism about not being too ornate, not becoming too obsessed with material things. That makes
Right.
sense. Now here are some ones that get a little bit stranger. One of them was to use local actors instead of hiring actors from other domains, to hire local actors and support them. So I was like, that's kind of cool, like support the local arts. Um, Another one, do not appoint Ronin from other provinces as record keepers.
Wow. Okay.
I guess like don't don't trust. If there's a wandering, I guess we didn't really go over the definition. The definition of a Ronin is a samurai that doesn't have a master anymore. So that is basically what a Ronin is. So yeah, don't trust Ronin from other districts to keep your records.
What's the name of this code so that we could look it up if anyone wants to
Yep.
check it
It's
out?
the 17 laws of the Asakura clan.
Right. Okay. And the
Yep.
Asakura clan is a known clan at that time, or?
Yes, it is. Again, this is a really complicated time period. There's so many clans, and I am more of a hobbyist in this regard. I'm not
Well,
an
I'm
expert
personally
by any
drawn to
means. Yeah.
the. I think that if you're really into this stuff, you do have to go back at least that far to the Sengoku Jidai, because there's no samurai in the same way after this. And these codes changed to more of a code of ethics and whatnot. But like you're saying here, there was an earlier one that's also not really. This doesn't sound like it's for a samurai, to be honest.
Yeah, I think this is more probably for the higher ranking samurai, because some of them again seem like administrative, right?
Right.
Another one here is listen to the views of common people, like when it comes to, farming or, I think the idea behind that one would be to have maybe realistic expectations when you're collecting rice as taxes, Um, no more building new castles in the province. I think that one was probably didn't want rival power.
Yeah.
Yeah, so again, it's a pretty surprising list. So a lot of these early sort of, we could almost call them like house rules, right? These early clan rules are really not what you would expect today, based upon the kind of modern understanding of Bushido. But I think, yeah, this would be a good time to perhaps skip forward, and yeah, we could talk about the five rings,
Yeah.
because
So
that's another quite famous book. Although again, it doesn't use the word Bushido in the book, but it's associated
right.
with Bushido.
Yeah. Basically, what you could say is, although the Sengoku Jidai arguably ended when Nobunaga entered Kyoto and announced himself as a shogun, it did carry over through to the Edo period when Tokugawa Ieyasu and the siege of Osaka and those later events happened. So during that time, Miyamoto Musashi fought for the Tokugawa shogunate and was actually active in squashing rebellions and things. So he was a samurai. However, he became a ronin at the end of that period. So during the Edo period, he just went on a mush shugyo, which is a pilgrimage for a warrior, and they would just travel anywhere, accepting challenges from other ronin. And he apparently won in over 60 duels, and he had his own sword style where he used two, because the daisho, which is the katana and the wakizashi, the long and short sword, or rather the sword and long sword, he thought utilizing both was the true way, because it would be foolish to die with one sword yet sheathed, is what he said. And as a figure, when we get into this episode and everything, I'm thinking about Musashi primarily for my interests, because as a martial artist, even though I haven't practiced sword arts, not yet anyway, just that book in itself, anyone could apply certain strategic, a lot of golden nuggets in there. So you could just apply that to any walk of life essentially. But he wrote that book in 1645, which was right before he died. But he was a Zen Buddhist, a poet, a gardener. He lived in a cave as almost like an aesthetic monk, and he trained other ronin. So he was basically running a dojo. So he's just like hugely influential. And when we think of the best samurai ever, it's always Musashi, because his track record, and his book. The book itself, which we have in its complete form, which is amazing that those scrolls were preserved into modern history, where we can just go and read them or listen to them. So it's like I'm pretty privileged even to be able to do that. So it's firsthand information that we have, and that's the first real like how to be a Ronin in that time type book.
Yeah. And yeah, Musashi, he seems like a pretty badass dude. Apparently he killed his first man in a duel when he was 13 and like beat him to death with a wooden sword.
Yeah,
There's
a
some pretty
boken.
there's some pretty crazy stories too. Like he was challenged to a duel and he like showed up 2 hours late just to mess with the guy, and the guy was really agitated, and then he killed him. And then the
With
clan
an oar.
was it with an oar in that story? Wow.
Yeah,
That
he
makes it even
carved it
better.
boken
Yeah.
from the oar.
Then the brother was sort of pressured into, the clan was like, oh, you gotta duel him, you gotta take care of him. And then this time he showed up early and waited for them and saw that the brother, who was, I guess he was younger, I don't know, maybe he was younger, inexperienced, and he showed up with kind of like a gang of guys, and they were going to ambush him. And then Musashi sort of waited in the bushes for a while, and then they were starting to get antsy. And then he just sprung out and like cut the brother down and like cut down a guy or two and then ran away. Which is pretty crazy. That's like something really out of a samurai movie or an anime. Um, but the interesting thing, though, reading the Book of Five Rings, is that, again, it doesn't mention Bushido, and it doesn't really talk a lot about personal conduct. It's a very pragmatic book. We can see certainly remnants of the, or at least echoes perhaps of the art of war in it. It also is a fencing manual. Like he gives actual practical advice on how to hold your sword, how to, have your feet, how to parry different attacks. So it seems like it's partially strategic, part fencing manual of sorts, or kendo man. I guess I should say kendo manual. Um, Although kendo as an art form, again, like a lot of martial arts, is more of it sort of was codified in more recent times, and then partially as well Zen. Yeah.
Yeah, the final chapters. So it's called the Gorin no Sho, the books of wind, water, fire, earth, and the final one is void. So I think that's kind of where the Zen Buddhism and philosophy and everything comes in more. And also, I know that he trained with certain Zen monks, and that he also wrote a final work called the Dekodo, or the Path of Aloneness. But that's kind of more of like a list. It's like 21 philosophical or life self rules for himself. So that's even kind of more like a Bushido type thing. But it's not included in the Book of Five Rings, which is just mainly intended as a fencing manual. But I think just going through that book inspired me to even want to learn kenjutsu or kendo, the way of the sword. Like, it does make you feel like, oh, this is really going to help me self improve. That's how I felt anyway. That's just me, but
Yeah, it's an enjoyable book, and well, I say it's a short read because the PDF, I mean, it's like open source, right? Because it's so old, so you can find it on Gutenberg or just different websites for free. The version that I had was, I think, 50 or 55 pages. So it's pretty short, but there's a lot of depth to it. It's certainly a book that you read through once and you have a lot of questions, and having just read through it, I feel like I need to read it again. It's certainly a book that you'd want to read multiple times to really grasp. Um, but yeah, it's a fascinating book, and I would highly recommend it to, our listeners out there.
yeah, I even imagine like just from training Brazilian jiu-jitsu, for example, you could apply the strategic, because there's stuff in there about, crushing a man's spirit and like penetrating the guard and all these things that I just think could apply to any martial arts, because even jiu-jitsu in itself was the art of the samurai when they were unarmed, right? It just became Brazilian jiu-jitsu. So it's definitely applicable for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of parts in the book about the ones I thought would be the most applicable to martial arts were about throwing your enemy off of balance, watching your enemy to see what kind of style that they have, then trying to react to their style. Not, allowing, if there's a movement that's useless, allowing your enemy to do it. But if your enemy is trying to accomplish something, maybe changing, in his case, probably like changing their footing or changing their stance. If they're getting into a more favorable position, you want to throw them off before they do that. Another one too is about kind of pushing them into awkward or disadvantageous positions. So I think he mentions, like, if it's outside, like kind of pushing them into like a tree or into a place where they're going to lose their footing, or if it's inside, kind of getting them into a corner. So there's certainly, I think, good advice in that. Again, I'm not a practitioner of kendo or any kind of fencing or sword fighting, but based upon my limited experience with martial arts, these do seem like they would be pretty universal principles that could be applied to different disciplines.
Well, also he said that if you compound the, controlling one man is the same as controlling 10 men, which is the same as controlling 100 men. So therefore, it is the art of full strategy that he teaches. So it really is like some Sun Tzu mixed with some fencing and a little Dao De Jing just sprinkled in or whatever, just for good measure. And yeah, that's kind of the stage where I would say the real Bushido becomes solidified, and that's everything from here on is decadent. Everything from here on is secondhand information. Everything from here on is romanticized, and these legends start coming about, and Musashi did this and he did that, and who knows how much of it's true. I mean, he didn't brag too much, so we can't really have 100% certainty on that. But I guess going into the Edo period, we have Ieyasu, the shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu, moving the capital to Edo, which will become Tokyo later. And this is when shogun is lord and peace is in Japan, and it's more of a merchant and artisan period. And Musashi goes through the like samurai class, merchant class, farmer class, artisan class. Those are the main, and those other classes start to rise, whereas shogun's here and emperor's down here. These other ones are starting to climb, and samurais are going down. And there's no employment for these men, really.
Yeah, so again, yeah, like you said, I mean, the samurai, they're a warrior class, and during the Sengoku period, there's obviously a lot of need for them. And prior to this, most other periods, there was pretty continuous warfare. But now we have the Edo period. So again, about 1600 up until 1868 with the Meiji Restoration. And of course, the early years are still a little turbulent, but by the time we get to about the mid 1600s or so, Japan is become a much more peaceful place. So you have 200 years essentially where there's peace, things have settled down. There's like you said, Albert, there's a growing merchant class. And as a result, yeah, there's not as much need for the samurai anymore. And their role starts to shift. It starts to shift from being warriors to more administrators, bureaucrats, tax collectors. And by the end of this period, there's actually a lot of samurai who are even giving up this position. By the kind of early to mid 1800s, a lot of samurai are giving up the class or profession because it's not profitable anymore. And there's lots of stories of samurai taking second jobs or becoming involved in, shoemaking, or becoming involved in other activities, or just focusing on farming in their domain, or again becoming ronin if they don't have a master, or taking on other roles that aren't necessarily martial ones, just because there's not really a need for this sort of strong, violent warrior class anymore in Japanese society at the time. Yeah, so Hagakure is another one of the books that is widely discussed when we talk about Bushido. And it's written by Tsunetomo, and he's a samurai, and then later he becomes a monk. And he is more of again, during this period where samurai are more bureaucrats, scholars, their role, in the previous century had been changing a lot. And so he is an interesting character because he really, in a lot of sense, this is the time where people start to become more nostalgic. People start to look back at this samurai past. And there's even passages in his book, talking about how, the spirit of one age ends, and, each moment or each day like is part of a new passing era. And so he kind of harkens back to this a lot. There's passages in the book about, how he's, I guess, anxious in a sense, or he's apprehensive about how the role of samurai and the role of men is changing. And there's some kind of even by our standards, what we would perceive to be kind of absurd passages where he's talking about how, young men are becoming more like women, which again, the first part of the sentence, this is something that I feel like almost every generation says. They always criticize the younger generation. They say, "Oh, you're not as, you don't have these values anymore. You're not as masculine as the old generation." So he starts off with that, but and says that the new generation of men is more feminine and they're not masculine because they don't know how to decapitate a man anymore.
Right.
Which again is ironic because there's no evidence that he was ever in a single battle or that he even killed a single person. So it's a little bit strange. Yeah.
I don't think we really mentioned that, like early on, maybe these ideas of seppuku and like righteous suicide, I guess, is an honor thing. Could you just go through that maybe? Because I think that's what he's referring to, if I'm correct. Well, I heard also, read or something, that there was, because of the sword, the katana, they had no way of testing them and how good the quality was. So they didn't want to lose the traditional art of making swords and the quality of it, the high quality. So they would test them on execution victims and whatnot. So that's possible too. But I have a quote here from Hagakure. It says, "In order to master this essence, you must die anew every morning and night." And I believe he goes on to say that counting yourself as dead is like the beginning of life, or it's kind of like Paul even writes something similar in the epistles. So it's interesting to see that virtue is like considering yourself a willing participant of death as opposed to running from it, so to speak. A lot of the arts, like we said about sword making and sword fighting and jiu-jitsu and all these things, were becoming modernized. We're starting to see things like kendo and much later judo, which are like sport versions of those techniques, because we're not out in the streets killing people as much. Now we have to find other ways to train and exercise, and thankfully we have kendo and things like that to preserve the essence. But this is a different Bushido. It's not so much about killing, it's about self-improvement, and also, just like you said, nostalgia towards a time. It's so revered, right?
There's some kind of funny parts in it as well. I like he also says it's bad taste to yawn in front of people. Like I for the listeners who maybe don't know, I taught in China for several years. I never taught in Japan though. But I had friends that one friend told me a story about how the students were really upset because he was checking his watch in class, right? Or he would yawn in class and they would be like, oh, like they complained to the principal and they're like, oh, he looks really bored. Like he doesn't,
Right.
it doesn't seem like he cares. And he's like, no, I really cared. I was just, checking the time because I had to make sure my lesson was flowing. Or, oh, I yawned because, I'm tired. I'm working like double shifts. Like
Yeah.
I don't mean it as a sign of respect. I'm just tired. But they kind of perceived it to be as such. So it is kind of interesting too to see those sort of, you can again, maybe it doesn't give us a great map of what the code of a warrior was like in the Sengoku period, but it does give a lot of insights into, 18th century, 19th century, well, I guess in this book, 18th century Japanese culture, and
But
like their etiquette, things like that.
do you think it was misused? Like, for example, in the film Ghost Dog, because he used it as a code of a warrior when, like you said, it's not even really that.
I don't think Ghost Dog misused anything because I think Ghost Dog is a great film, and I think that's part of the point of the film is that Forrest Whitaker's character is a very strange guy. Like he's not only his character is not only misinterpreting the past, he also is misinterpreting the present. Remember, he keeps calling the so for those of you who don't know, it's a film about a guy that's a bit different. We might describe him as sort of like a savant type character. He's very skilled at being an assassin, but he's a very strange and socially awkward sort of individual. And he works for the mafia as a hitman, and he constantly calls his whatever the mafia guy that he reports to. He calls him he says I'm your retainer. He uses like the samurai language when describing his hits. And I think that there's even a scene where somebody's like, "What does that mean? You're my retainer."
So
um,
in a sense, it is an accurate portrayal of Hagakure because they're both a little bit off,
yeah,
in
they're
a
both
sense.
sort of not like they're not really they're people, they're character individuals, or in the Ghost Dog case, characters who are sort of out of time. They're sort of anachronistic. They're like don't really belong in this time period in a sense. So I think it's actually kind of accurate in that regard. Now we're moving into the era past the samurai and just how Bushido has been interpreted in later periods. Um, so in the Meiji Restoration, so 1868, this is when the shogun is kind of overthrown. The imperial power is restored. Japan transforms from a feudal system into an empire. The samurai class is also abolished. It's a time of great change in Japan. Kind of comes out as a result of in the 1850s, the Americans under Commodore Matthew Perry, whose name I always thought was funny because of the Friends actor. So Perry shows up, and it's kind of this gunboat diplomacy, and basically they have this show of force, and they have their steamship. They fire off the cannons and say, "Hey, look at our ships. You're going to open up trade with us." And so it kind of opens up these unequal treaties, and it really throws the Japanese perceptions. Just it really throws them off because they see, oh well, again they had guns. They had gotten guns from the Portuguese, in the 1500s, I believe. I know Nobunaga was. That's another reason why he was able to win, right? There's
Well,
so just
yeah, he worked with Christian missionaries and things. He was more at odds with the Buddhists, actually,
Mhm.
which was something we didn't mention. The other thing we didn't mention is the Mongol invasions, but that's like another topic too. So it's like
Yeah,
it's
there's
really
just
hard.
so many things to like focus on here,
Yeah,
but
exactly. It's beautiful. It's this is the time when we're getting the Last Samurai film type thing, right? Where we're
mhm.
getting Americans interacting with the Japanese. In the Meiji Restoration, they opened up to the West, whether it was willing or not, it's debatable, but it's it turned out to be fruitful in a sense for the emperor. Like you said, they already had guns. Samurai did use guns. He was able to use more advanced guns, even these machine guns and things, and he overthrew the samurai, wiped them out in a. I mean, how accurate is that film? Maybe you have a better insight on that.
It's been a while since I watched it. I don't think I've watched that film since I was a teenager. From my understanding, there's a lot of historical inaccuracies. I mean, for one, it makes the samurai look like they're against using guns because of honor, which again, as we just said, totally not true. You know, the most powerful lord that came out of the Warring States period, Nobunaga, it's not only for this reason, but one of the reasons he was able to prevail was because he saw the utility of firearms and started to purchase weapons from the Portuguese, and started to train like early kind of musketeers. So the samurai weren't against using firearms. So I think that's one of the inaccuracies of the film. Again, it's been a while since I saw it, but yeah, that is the sort of period, the Meiji Restoration, the sort of end of samurai rule, which again, this is another case of a movie that is really romanticizing this sort of past. During this time afterwards, Japan realizes that they've fallen behind, they've got to catch up. They start to adopt a lot more of they start to bring in specialists from Europe. They start to industrialize. And it's during the Meiji Restoration, after the Meiji Restoration, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. I mean, Japan's transformation is quite remarkable. They go from being a feudal country that had, sort of old style arquebuses, and was very
Well, let's face it, they were behind the times, right? They realized that they were behind the times, and if they wanted to compete on the world stage, they would have to catch up. And they did just that.
Yeah. And so they go from being that to, by the time of World War II, creating a vast empire spanning across Asia. But to bring it back just a little bit here to the late 1890s, 1899, we do have Bushido starting to spread to the West. So that brings us into perhaps the final book that we can briefly talk about.
Well, when I was in Vancouver, I saw that there was at the UBC campus a garden dedicated to the author of this book.
Nazo Notobe, he wrote a book called Bushido, The Soul of Japan, and this came out in 1899.
Anyway, he wrote this book, and it was read by Teddy Roosevelt and many other well-known Western leaders and politicians. And it basically just kind of compares Bushido to the West and their code of chivalry that they had during, like we said, they're behind the times in a sense, and chivalry maybe had faded out a long time ago in the West, but he was saying that Bushido is a kind of way for us to reconnect to that code and the good things that we lost from that time. And he compares to, the Judeo-Christian morals and values. There's another author, Lin Yutang, who's a Christian from China, who wrote about Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, and tried to bring it back, which a lot of people critique them for. Is we're not supposed to be making these connections because essentially we're different things and whatnot. But he was one that sought to bridge that gap, I suppose, even though I guess nationalism would overtake Bushido in a sense during this time, is what I took away from researching this, is just how nationalistic they became. And Bushido was actually used as propaganda. And I guess this gentleman was seeking to restore, even though this was before the total extent of that, he was seeking to restore a kind of understanding between the West and Japan.
Yeah, so that's too. That seems to be my understanding. So I know he was a Christian. He was a Japanese Christian. He was Western educated. I again, I didn't get around to reading this particular book, but I read up on it, and I know that in the preface of the book, he mentions that he was studying. I think he was in Pennsylvania. He was studying there. I forget which school he was at. But he was studying, and somebody approached him, and they were having a conversation about religion, and they said to him, "Well, how do you Japanese people derive your morals? How do you teach people moral education without having Christianity as your main religion?" And he said he thought about that, and that was one of the things that inspired him to write the book, was to try to teach Westerners about Japanese values, and also, like you said too, to try to draw parallels as well with European knights and chivalry, to help make it more palatable, I guess, to help Westerners understand more. So again, I think that this guy, I think he had good intentions, but this has led to quite a few misconceptions. So again, like you were saying before, during this period, nationalism was on the rise, militarism in Japan was on the rise. There was no longer the samurai, but the army was growing in its political power in Japan, and
This
Bushido.
time under the emperor, right? This is under the emperor.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's sort of this classical trend in Japanese history where the Meiji Restoration happens, and the government, the emperor is supposed to be in charge, and then it becomes sort of like a somewhat democratic system, but then the military ends up gaining power, and the military ends up basically controlling the country. Um, and as the military yields greater and greater influence, they start to basically adopt or appropriate some of these ideas of Bushido, and they use that as a sort of propaganda to basically indoctrinate soldiers, and to push ideas of courage, or not surrendering, or die before you surrender. And so so there is a lineage here between this sort of, again, I don't want to say necessarily the original Bushido, because what the original Bushido is, as we've discussed, is very complicated, and it's not just one thing, but this sort of modern conception of Bushido that develops as Japan is rapidly industrializing and changing and opening up to the world. There's a sort of lineage there between these ideas, and then later what gets adopted by the Japanese military, and then leads to things like kamikaze attacks or banzai charges. And certainly it's not the cause, and again, it's an appropriation of an earlier idea, but it is used to justify certain beliefs or actions or behaviors which do lead to some Japanese war crimes in the Second World War. So I think that's important to mention.
Right, and they would even carry katana and things into the battles to show that this is the noble and honorable war that we're fighting. And maybe it was in their eyes. Certainly it's hard to, with any of this stuff, judge it from a modern. That's not what I'm trying to do, is like put impose my opinion on it. It's just to read about it is something you have to do from an objective sort of place, I guess, and just embrace what's good about it. I think Bushido has a lot of good things to offer, like we spoke about, but now we're seeing that darker side again rearing its ugly head during World War II. And thankfully now we're past all that.
Yeah, and then I guess to wrap it up here, after World War II, again, a lot of there was a lot of contact. Japan was occupied. A lot of people in the West started to get exposed to these ideas, and so this also contributed to this sort of these ideals of how the Japanese believe they should never surrender, never give up. Later, a lot of these books end up getting picked up by people in business. So much like say the Art of War, which we talked about, briefly mentioned earlier. A lot of these books, like the Art of War, the Book of Five Rings, they get picked up by people in a variety of communities, but in particular, I would say the two communities that have picked it up the most are people in business and people in martial arts. People in business have picked up some of these older texts to try to think of ways that they can be maybe cunning or get the advantage in a business negotiation. And then as well, a lot of these ideas and these ideals about these morals, ideas about how to, dedication, honesty, hard work, a lot of these ideals too have then continued on in the martial arts community today. We have a special guest as well, who's going to share his insights into Bushido. So I think that'll be a good way to wrap up this episode.
So when it comes to like the warrior code and modern day martial arts, I think that's a very important factor that I feel a lot of martial artists and even martial arts schools have gotten away from, right? Is the importance of, practicing your craft, but also having, I guess, a code to live your life by, right? As a martial artist, especially back then where you weren't just a martial artist, you were a warrior. There's a certain way you're supposed to carry yourself. You're not supposed to, take advantage of those weaker than you, use your skills to intimidate and things like that. And, even though that's the code even they had back then, many, many people did not follow that code, right?
Right.
That's almost like the ideal way that you should carry yourself as a martial artist and a warrior, right? And maybe the best of them and the best of us adhere to all the tenets, right? Because the tenets of Bushido, it's just good ways to live your life, to be a good person. And
Right.
I think that's also something that people forget about martial arts, right? Everyone thinks that martial arts is always about fighting, right? And though you do learn martial skills through martial arts, of course, the ability to fight and things like that isn't even one of the most important factors, right? Is ideally becoming a better person or a better version of yourself or the best possible version of yourself is the real goal of martial arts, right? And other than that, you have discipline, respect, right? Because especially when it comes to training for long periods of time, you need discipline, right? You need to be able to do it even when you don't like doing it or love doing it anymore, right? One of the most important ways to build and maintain skill is consistency. And that's a huge problem I think now that people have when it comes to martial arts is in like a capitalist Western society, right? Because it's so easy to quit things. No one gives you like shit for quitting things, right? Like people quit school all the time. People quit martial arts all the
Accountability,
time,
right?
right? Is like is for example like most people enter a martial art, they quit before they even get their first belt. They quit at white belt, right? There's even like a huge, I guess, joke when it comes in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that once someone gets their blue belt, you'll never see them again. And I've always thought that was wild because I've been just doing martial arts for so long. I've gone away from it at times, that's true. But that's only when like, important things of life have come in the way, like when I went to university and stuff like that. And even still, I trained, but to a lesser degree, right? And people make all kinds of excuses not to train too, like, oh, it's Friday night, I'm not going to go train. It's like, no, man, Friday night's the most important day to train because there's all these other things you could be doing, right? So when it comes to the Bushido, that Bushido code is a very ideal way to carry yourself as a martial artist, a warrior, and even as a person. And I find like in modern day society, that's something that we're really getting away from.
Why do you think that is? Just because, like you said, it's so easy to give up and no one holds you accountable? Or do you think it's just a weaker inner character that
Uh,
people...
it's, I guess, a mix of those factors. It's so easy to quit things nowadays, right? For example, like you have a marriage, quit your marriage, right? It's
Yeah.
like divorce was seen as like completely unacceptable thing back in the day. And I'm not saying there's never a reason to get divorced. Like, obviously, if someone's being abused or there's infidelity, things like that, that's obviously reason to get divorced. But people, I feel, quit on marriages without even trying to work on it. They're just like, I don't like this person anymore, right? And it just shows, like, no discipline when marriage is supposed to be, in our society, seen as like a sacred union, right? And people quit school. They're like university. I feel like, man, when I went, like, all kinds of people dropped out. Man, I've dropped out too. So
Me too.
and no one gives you a hard time about that anymore. It should be, when you have a commitment like that, it should be like, no, you have to finish your job, right? It's too easy to
Right.
quit in today's society, right? It's like we're almost taught to just give up and do the path of least resistance, right? People in general, I feel, don't want to work hard anymore. And that's why I think when it comes to, especially now in modern day society, there's almost no place for martial arts, right? Because everyone's like, oh, we just want our kids to have fun. It's like, oh, I'm just doing this as a hobby to stay active. And I'm like, okay, all those things are important, but it's a martial art, it's a military art. You're there to listen, you're there to learn, right? There's a certain way that you have to present yourself, right? It's like you line up this way, you bow this way, you do what you're told to be doing. Like, you're not supposed to be running around in circles, right? A lot of places, I feel like, even in school, right, teachers can't discipline kids anymore. If the person who's supposed to be in control of that room can't discipline anybody, how can anything get done? Right? So
Yeah.
it's a huge societal issue, I feel, that it makes almost that warrior code and the way of the warrior impossible to be a part of modern day life.
But do you think that's why people like us reach towards Bushido, even at an intellectual or philosophical level, just because we lack it within our community? So we have to instill it in ourselves and find it from a different culture that doesn't even necessarily exist anymore. And the
I
martial
think,
arts are a way to bring that to the present, in a sense.
listen, I think martial arts martial arts have existed in every society. A code of honor has existed in every society. If you look, for example, at the Bushido code, it's probably pretty similar to the tenets of Christianity or Islam, things like that. Like any old code of honor, you're supposed to live yourself by. You have honor, you have respect. You take care of your kids, right? You take care of your community. It's just a basic fundamental way of how you should be living your life, right? And that's not always easy, right? And in modern day society, there's so many conveniences we have that it's really easy for us to take shortcuts, right? So I think people at their core gravitate towards that warrior code, but some get turned off of it because it's not easy, right? Like,
Right.
I feel like everyone does want to have honor. I feel like everyone does want to have respect, right? I feel like everyone does want to be a productive member of society. Everyone wants to be able to defend themselves and their loved ones, right? But sometimes when the going gets tough, you know, tough get going. You know what I mean?
Yeah, understandable.
So as an instructor, have you noticed with any of your students that that coming to class and training harder and trying to follow the stricter regiment and these principles? Have you heard many people say that it carries over into the rest of their everyday life?
Yeah, with a lot of kids it does, right? They will become tougher. They will become, I feel, more responsible, and they will become kinder people, right? The longer they do it, right? And if they do it for the right reasons. Of course, those lessons also have to be reinforced by their parents, right? So if you're teaching them one thing, in the school, and then they have no restrictions outside, it's going to be a lot harder for those lessons to stick. Maybe over a long period of time, eventually you'll get through, but it's not enough just to live that way or listen to, or follow the code when you're on the mats. It also has to carry on in the home as well. But that being said, I got to go teach you class right now. Thank you guys for having me on.
Okay, that appears to be all we have time for on today's episode. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as whichever platform you listen to your podcasts on. And you can even follow us on Instagram too. Radiant_light_podcast. And you can always reach out to us at radiantlightpodcast1, that's the number 1, at gmail.com. So until next time, good night, God bless, and Namaste.